report HUD's oversight of Alexander County, Illinois Housing Authority. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. Without objection, members of the full committee who are not members of this subcommittee may participate in today's hearing for the purpose of making an opening statement and questioning our witnesses. The chair now recognizes himself 4 or 5 minutes for an opening statement. I first want to thank our first panel of witnesses who are here today. They're going to be introduced in just a moment, but Congressman Bost and Senator Duckworth, welcome back to the House side. It's good to have you. We appreciate your testimony and appreciate the testimony of our IG. Today we'll be examining issues related to the Alexander County Housing Authority, ACHA, and their role in allowing living conditions in both the Elmwood and McBride housing developments to deteriorate to such that the HUD had to demolish both of them and has taken over possession of the ACHA. Due to the actions of the ACHA, nearly 200 families will have to uproot their lives and move from Cairo, Illinois to another city, hopefully in Illinois, but somewhere else. In addition to Elmwood and McBride, we've come to find out that 2 additional ACHA housing developments will be closed due to the cost of rehabilitation. And so, more families might have to leave Cairo for another community. Having served as chairman of this subcommittee for the 115th Congress, the conclusion of the HUD IG's report on the ACHA is disgusting at a minimum and possibly criminal with those who were involved in the ACHA. What's even more frightening is this could just be the tip of the iceberg around the country. 50 other PHAs, public housing authorities, have been designated as troubled according to the HUD IG report. The ACHA's activities are a prime example of abuse of government funds by a PHA. Now, it's my understanding that the IG will be limited in his questions, that he'll be answering in regard to some of the specifics in regard to individuals involved in fraud and potential abuse at the ACHA. We're going to do our best to respect that as there is an ongoing investigation. I'll try to be respectful. Again, if the IG feels like he can't answer specific questions from me or the panel, we do support the rule of law and the presumption of innocence. To be candid, though, I think the recommendations made by the IG are what should be done at a minimum. This is a floor of recommendation, and we very well may need to do more. I don't want to get into that much of Mr. Kirkland's testimony for him. We want to hear from him himself, so I don't want to say too much about that. But the disarray of the ACHA and these units in particular, first discovered in 2010, incredibly problematic, incredibly disturbing, and to think that these are the families that we are here to help who are living in these kind of conditions. Again, I think every American would be outraged that this is how we house people or help house people and how we spend the federal taxpayers' money. Maybe PHAs, based on the IG's report and my assessment of that, maybe PHAs should be under more scrutiny and provisions of funds should be conditional once a PHA has been identified as having negative findings. I believe HUD is working to address some of the issues identified by the IG report, but we might need to look further at HUD's recovery and sustainability protocols when it comes to PHA. We have to scratch and dig, I think, deeper. The fact that these families, again, lived in deplorable conditions for 6 years before HUD finally took over the ACHA is just fundamentally inexcusable. To add on top of that, the ACHA clearly misused federal funds and violated the Civil Rights Act via racial segregation and employment discrimination. What? This is unbelievable that in 2018, this is actually happening. Right now, about 1.2 million reside in public housing developments that are operated by around 3,300 PHAs. HUD provides about $4 billion in operating subsidies and awards about another $2 billion to PHAs to maintain those public housing properties. I believe we have good PHAs out there, but we've come to find out that there is abuse in at least one and possibly more. We have an opportunity to make sure all 3,300 PHAs comply with HUD's policies and address health and safety hazards before another situation like Cairo pops up. I just want to note that if you watch this committee, and I say this often, and it's a testament to Mr. Cleaver, we always don't agree. We always don't get along. But in this space, you find bipartisan support. You don't see light between either side of the aisle and either party on these issues. This is about families. This is about dignity. And this is about America standing together to make sure people have a safe, livable home to which reside. My time has expired. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My opening comments will be brief, primarily because you have stated very clearly and eloquently what I wish to express. I think that originally there was interest by Senator Durbin and Senator Dugworth, the senators from Illinois. The troublesome thing for me, and I'll move on and wait until the questioning. I actually grew up in the projects, and we had the black public housing developments. There were two, and then we had the white. There was no pretense of trying to, say that they were the same. That, it was, everybody in town knew it, and there was nothing ever done about it. I thought that those days had ended a long time ago. And to imagine that after all these years, we're still experiencing that same kind of stupid conduct on the part of people who are really being paid by the United States federal government, by the taxpayers, and that makes it even worse. And so, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the hearing. I don't want anybody to come to the conclusion that other people are not interested. This is a fly-in day, as the Congressman knows, but and so a lot of people are still trying to get to Washington for 6:30 votes, and then we have some other weather-related problems. But this is nonetheless an extremely important issue, and I worked on myself before I came in here so that I would not, become emotional or loud, because this is very, very personal to me. And when we get through with the committee, I'm calling my dad to talk to him about this. At age 96, he will be stunned. I mean, he probably, thought that 30 years ago this was over. So I want to talk with him about today's hearing, and then I know he'll also calm me down. Right now, the calmtivity, there's no such word, but I feel like I can make up some words for this. The calmtivity is not as strong as I need, but I will restrain myself just to make sure I am extremely angry, and it's personal. Thank you very kindly.
The gentleman yields back. I now want to welcome our witnesses. Our first witness, Congressman Mike Bost from the 12th District of Illinois, approached me on the floor a year ago, wanted a hearing. I told him we can't. We want to wait for the IG report. Came out, pushed us to have a hearing, and we wanted to make sure we got it in as quickly as possible. Congressman Bost, welcome, and thank you for your advocacy on this issue. I want to thank Senator Duckworth for being here. We sprung this at her, and she has a busy schedule, and was able to move her schedule around to be here as the senator from Illinois. I know that Senator Durbin wanted to be here as well, and he was not able to move his schedule, but I thank the both of you as representatives of Illinois and of this location for being here and willing to testify. In a moment, both witnesses will be recognized for 5 minutes for an oral presentation of their written testimony. Without objection, their written statements will be made part of the record following their oral remarks. Representative Bost, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Duffy, and thank you, Ranking Member Cleaver. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you in the subcommittee. Today's hearing is about government's failure to protect its most vulnerable of us. Most of you have never heard of Cairo, Illinois. Matter of fact, if you saw it, you would say Cairo, and unless you're from this district, you would actually, that's when you pronounce it as Cairo. But it's time that you've heard about it, time you should hear about it. Cairo's a small town in my district that was once a roaring city on the banks of the Mississippi and Ohio River. It shares a story that is similar to many across the country, perhaps those similar to those in your districts. As the 20th century rolled on, Cairo's population dwindled due to changes in transportation, community strife, a lack of service, and downright neglect. But many families stayed, proud of their city, honoring their heritage. Most of these families live in public housing units under the control of Alexander County Housing Authority. Many of us first learned the extent of the problems in Cairo through reports in the Southern Illinois newspaper. The paper exposed unsafe living conditions that included units infested with mold, insects, and other vermin. Many had no appliances, heating, or air conditioning. One mother was forced to spray insect killer around her young son's bed each night due to infestation in her unit. After my Illinois colleagues and I requested a federal investigation, HUD placed the Housing Authority in receivership. The buildings were beyond repair. 185 families were forced to leave a city they called home for generations. The cause of this tragedy comes down to two words: greed and neglect. Over many years, the local housing authority used federal funds as their personal piggy bank. Funding intended for maintenance was used for personal travel and other perks. The executive director at the time admitted to fraud. He said we lived it up too good, and we didn't even see this coming, and we thought it would last forever. Then there's the issue of neglect, which I believe should be the main focus of this hearing. Issues with Cairo Housing Authority were known to HUD for years, but little was done. It is my belief that had HUD taken these issues more seriously, we may not be here today. The federal government must do a better job of conducting oversight, especially when it involves the health and safety of people in need. Where was the ball dropped on Cairo? How did things fall through the cracks? And where is it happening in other public housing around America? And how do we prevent this from happening again? While I may not be a member of this committee, I want to work with you, Republicans and Democrats, to ensure that reform is implemented. I also want those who created this crisis to be held accountable. It's frustrating to me and the people of my district that these officials have not been charged for their alleged crimes. The people of Cairo and surrounding areas deserve justice. I hope today is a big step in making that happen. And once again, I thank you for holding this hearing. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady, the senator from Illinois, Senator Duckworth, for 5 minutes. And again, welcome back, Senator. Nice of you to come over to our side of the Capitol.
Yes, and I used to be just down the hall in OIG, so not too far away. It's good to be back, and I do miss my colleague, Representative Cleaver's daily affirmations and thoughts that he would give us every day as we proceed to do the people's business here in the House of Representatives. Chairman Duffy, Ranking Member Cleaver, thank you for holding this important meeting. In February of 2016, after continued instances of mismanagement, willful neglect of resident safety, and both improper and illegal policies at the local level, I stress illegal policies at the local level, HUD took into receivership the Alexander County Housing Authority, ACHA. By this report's own conclusion, HUD was aware of these problems as early as 2010, but hesitated to exercise its authority to bring ACHA into compliance. In fact, the ACHA has failed HUD's physical assessment tool used to determine if a unit is habitable since 2012. Senator Durbin and I solely requested this HUD OIG report to get to the bottom of how HUD failed these residents, and following the report's release in July, we wrote to Secretary Carson urging quick implementation of the IG's recommendations. Yesterday, we finally received a response to our letter, in which HUD agreed to implement these recommendations and provide timelines for that implementation. With the permission of the chairman and ranking member, I'd like to submit for the record the letters Senator Durbin and I sent, as well as the response we received from HUD. I'm also submitting written testimony from both Senator Durbin and myself regarding today's hearing.
Without objection.
Thank you. I've seen firsthand the conditions these residents live in. I visited the facilities, I talked to the residents, and in fact, I continue to speak with the residents, telephoning key community leaders from time to time. They face mismanagement, and they continue to have to recover from this mismanagement. Many families are now split apart, living in separate counties without the support of their loved ones. And so we must continue to listen to these residents and hold accountable the officials who failed them and created this crisis in Cairo. In addition, I hope we can all work together to provide these residents and similar communities with the resources they need to restore their public housing stock and guarantee safe, healthy, and affordable housing. I appreciate the opportunity to join this committee and raise awareness for the people of Cairo. I'm here on behalf of both Senator Durbin and myself. He is on the Judiciary Committee on the Senate side, so he's a little bit busy this week. Thank you again, Chairman Duffy and Ranking Member Cleaver, for having this, and from both Senator Durbin and I, thank you for bringing this to your attention. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator. And I just want to thank the both of you for your testimony and for your bipartisan effort to improve the conditions. And as common practice for members of Congress and senators, that the panel does not ask you questions. So at this point, you're excused, and I want to thank you for your testimony. If you all would just wait one moment as we do a transition to our second panel, we will switch out over the next minute or two. And now for our second panel, a witness of one, I want to welcome Mr. Jeremy Kirkland, the Acting Deputy Inspector General for HUD. We appreciate you being here. Without objection, the witness's written statement will be made part of the record following his oral remarks. Once the witness has finished presenting his testimony, each member of the subcommittee will have 5 minutes within which to ask him questions on the report and his statement. Just note that on your table you have 3 lights. Green means go, yellow means you have 1 minute left, and red means that your time is up. It's pretty obvious. The microphone is sensitive, so please make sure you turn it on and speak directly into it. Mr. Kirkland, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Duffy, Ranking Member Cleaver, and members of the subcommittee. I am Jeremy Kirkland, and I am the Acting Deputy Inspector General for HUD's Office of the Inspector General. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you today the results of our evaluation and HUD's oversight of the Alexander County Housing Authority, or ACHA. HUD OIG examined the allegations of misuse of federal funds following a referral from HUD. My testimony will focus on the evaluation of HUD's oversight of ACHA following multiple congressional requests. The evaluation identified what could be systemic issues which plague many similarly situated public housing agencies. The Office of Public and Indian Housing operates HUD's public housing program and is responsible for monitoring PHAs and ensuring effective controls are in place to prevent problems. HUD provides approximately $4 billion in operating subsidies to assist PHAs annually, and approximately $2 billion to PHAs annually to develop, modernize, and maintain public housing properties. PHAs are entities authorized by the state to be caretakers of public housing funds and must ensure that the funds are properly managed. In the past, HUD-OIG identified that a significant cause of the deficiencies included that executive directors and boards of commissioners at PHAs either ignored requirements or lacked sufficient knowledge to properly administer the program. ACHA is a moderate-sized PHA with nearly 500 units in its inventory. As part of our evaluation, we conducted 24 interviews with current and former HUD officials and collected documentation addressing HUD's actions to oversee ACHA. A combination of poor local management and ineffective oversight resulted in approximately 200 children, along with their families, living in units with pest infestations, including roaches, rodents, and bed bugs, inoperable appliances and electrical breakers, obstructed accessibility routes, among other health and safety issues. We found that HUD knew about the negative conditions at ACHA since at least 2010. We found that HUD identified weaknesses in ACHA's financial condition as early as FY 2013, and we found that HUD identified issues with ACHA's governance, including misuse of funds, conflicts of interest, and failure to comply with HUD policies and federal civil rights laws. While HUD has the authority to determine that financial, physical, management, and ethical problems cannot be remedied through the PHA Recovery and Sustainability or the FARS protocol, and therefore HUD could rule the PHA in substantial default without requiring a 2-year cure period, our report identified that HUD officials did not understand that flexibility existed. On February 19, 2016, HUD finally did declare ACHA in substantial default of its contract with HUD, removed its board, and took possession of the housing authority in a process called receivership. We also found that HUD initially hesitated to exercise its authority to place ACHA into receivership. A key takeaway from me is HUD officials use policy and frequently an incorrect understanding or interpretation of policy to justify inaction. As such, it appears that PIH may have failed to use some tools available. Our recommendations to HUD were to look to identify early when cross-programmatic reviews and enforcement actions against PHAs are required, that HUD train PIH officials on the authorities and processes for identifying, declaring, and managing PHAs in substantial default, that PIH update and strengthen the training program for HUD receivers of PHAs, and that PIH update procedures for receiverships. HUD-OIG remains concerned that without additional oversight, engagement, and outreach by PIH, there remains increased risk of fraud, waste, abuse, and gross mismanagement within these PHAs. At this time, I am open to any questions you might have about the report and the work on ACHA.
The gentleman yields back to turn and recognizes himself for 5 minutes for questioning. I think anybody who hears about the conditions are outraged. And I want to thank you, Mr. Kirkland, for your report and your investigation and helping bring this to light in the Congress. It's fair to say that HUD knew there were problems in the ACHA. Fair enough?
That is correct.
And they knew back in 2010, but we only use 2010 because that's as far as we asked you to look back. But they probably knew before 2010. Is that a fair assessment?
We did not look past 2010, but the conditions seem obvious that they didn't start overnight.
Right, so it's fair to say that in 2010 was not the magic year that things started to deteriorate. It's probably been happening for some time.
That is likely the case.
And where does the buck stop? I mean, how high do these things go? Who's responsible? Who do we look to go, you know what, there's mismanagement underneath you, but the buck stops with you? Who do we look to say, whoa, 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 it's...
Ultimately, as has been pointed out, I think this has been an absolute failure at every level, but every level failed the residents in Alexander County miserably.
Does it go to the HUD secretary?
Ultimately,
Go that high?
Ultimately, we all have a responsibility to ensure these residents have safe.
So I'm going to be, and I'm not asking. I don't care about politics. I don't care. I'm not trying to point fingers at anybody. This is a really bipartisan effort. I just want to know. And by the way, I would just note that there's a lot of problems in HUD, and there's hearings that we can throw barbs at both sides of the political aisle. I'm not asking for that reason. I want to know how high does it go. This is the HUD secretary should know about this and give demands or recommendations to fix it. Is that fair, or is it someone below the secretary?
Ultimately, this should have gone to the HUD secretary's attention, and ultimately the HUD secretary should have acted.
Should have acted. And in 2010, HUD's PIH identified issues at the ACHA. You mentioned that during a review, but nothing was done, right?
That is correct.
What do we do? What does this committee do? Because again, these are not partisan issues. We have bipartisan failures within HUD that affect people's lives. What does this committee do? What does this Congress do to make things actually work and improve people's lives and make sure our taxpayers' money is spent well to improve people's lives and living conditions?
I think the circumstances of beginning to address this problem start with the recommendations in our evaluation. I do believe those fundamental flaws that reared their head in Alexander County are not going to go away unless we begin to collectively figure out a path forward on these types of issues. It's not going to take one individual stepping in. It's not going to take one group stepping in. It's ultimately going to take a fundamental change in the approach that we take to public housing.
Should we review the structure of the PIH in terms, should it be reorganized?
While we have not looked at that issue, obviously that is a question that I think HUD should answer and can answer.
Okay, so quickly, this was not an issue of money, though. Did we not send enough money to make sure people don't live in these conditions? And if we did, what was there?
There was obviously a lot of money sent to Alexander County to,
And money didn't solve the problem, did it?
and money didn't solve the problem.
It was mismanagement. And I don't want to ask you about specifics of liability, but if we look at this as a whole, and if this is not the only scenario that's out there in our PHAs, should there be other kind of liability for boards that run these PHAs?
I absolutely believe
Criminal?
boards should be held accountable. Executive directors should be held accountable
Civilly and criminally?
civilly and criminally.
And I bet if we held people criminally liable for their work on these boards, one, you'd get good people who know what they're doing, and they would make sure they do their job because they don't want to go to jail or prison because of mismanagement. And frankly, and I look at, people should be held accountable for the money that was spent and the conditions that people were living in. Unacceptable. I will look forward to continuing to work with you on what this committee should do, on how we should evaluate, do further hearings, potentially legislate changes to make sure this doesn't happen again. With that, my time has expired. I yield to the ranking member, Mr. Cleaver, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me first of all say I've been on the committee for 14 years, so I've been through a lot and heard a lot and participated in a lot. The only time I've been more upset is in the aftermath of the 2008 economic crisis. Greed brought the world to the very brink of an economic cataclysm. And as of today, I'll check when I get back to the office. As of today, nobody has been indicted. and it was clear, it was as clear as day. I think most of the people up here are attorneys except for me and Ms. Beatty, but for even a layperson, it was clear as day that some people broke laws and did just about everything conceivably possible, and nobody, as of today, went to jail. My son saw that movie they did, and we walked with my wife and me, we walked out of the movie theater. He wouldn't even speak to me. I mean, he's a young kid, just angry. He said, nobody's been charged with anything, and that's how I feel about this issue. You know, if some of the kids who lived in public housing had broke into the PHA office and stolen a computer, they'd be in jail. You know, a $500 computer, they'd be in jail. And these, I mean, these greedy people, is your report going to be sent to the Justice Department?
I can confirm that we have referred this matter to the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of Illinois, and that matter has been accepted for criminal and civil prosecution.
Okay, I feel better. Not a lot, because people are still hurting. But that brings me to the other point. I think you requested the emails in November, and you received them in June, something like that. I may have gotten turned around a little. In your report, you said that, you know, that depending on what you find, you know, you would might have additional information. I'm wondering if you have any idea when the analysis of those 50 gigabytes of emails you've received will be available.
We've received almost 16,000 emails. So far, we've reviewed about 6,000 of those emails. We do have the team that completed this report is a fairly small but nimble team. They are working very, very hard to work through those emails, and we do intend to produce them as quickly as possible. We do recognize the importance of those issues. I will say, to date, the emails have confirmed and actually enhanced or bolstered our assessment of that. My bad, we got 600,000 emails and only 16,000 have been reviewed.
Oh, man.
And I will say that one of the concerns, and obviously there was a lot of time from our request for these emails and the actual production of those emails, and recognizing that we've raised concerns on the process in which HUD produces those emails. There is a fundamental concern that we at the OIG have with the fact that we don't have immediate access to this type of information.
Yeah, 7 months.
IG should have immediate access to that type of information.
Yes, I agree. I mean, 7 months, when I saw that, I thought, what in the world? I mean, you know, what could they have possibly done in a 7-month period? My other question is whether or not there is some kind of interest being given to those individuals who were moved out of those housing units. I mean, is there any follow-up? Do you know if there's been any follow-up to make sure that all of the individuals who've been moved are in fact in a decent housing unit someplace in Cairo?
I do not know the answer to that. That would be a question that I would think HUD should and could answer and should be able to answer.
In 7 months?
Yes.
They should be able to answer it in 7 months. Okay. I'll ask the question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Rothfuss, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kirkland, what should be the process to prevent the type of deplorable conditions that were witnessed by HUD officials out at the ACHA?
I think it's a cascading effect, but I do think when HUD finally engaged in a cross-programmatic review of what was going on in ACHA, you finally saw action by HUD. I think it took a collective effort on HUD's part to ensure that action could be taken. I think the recommendations within our report, specifically the one for HUD to view that more cross-programmatically, allows it more tools in the toolbox.
Can you tell me what ultimately caused HUD to place the ACHA in administrative receivership? What was the final straw?
I think there were no alternatives. I do think, as the report revealed, when the FHEO forced the hand of PIH, that ultimately caused the steps to be taken.
Going back to 2010, when the Public and Indian Housing identified issues at ACHA during review but closed the findings, why did PIH close out its findings after identifying possible issues within the Housing Authority and its governance?
They said that the responses were acceptable, but we did not find any documentation or really any one that could support that why they determined ACHA's responses in 2013 were acceptable.
Could several of the violations outlined in your July 2018 report have been avoided if HUD had followed through on its findings in 2010?
We really didn't look specifically at the time frame of that, but I will say, obviously, the earlier HUD would have engaged in a process. I do think these families would have been able to find a better situation sooner if HUD had engaged earlier.
Let's see, the HUD OIG mentioned in its report that although it may be too late to save ACHA as of June 2018, 50 other PHAs were designated as troubled. What procedures does PIH have in place to prevent housing authorities from becoming troubled?
So PIH has identified that they go through this FARS protocol, which is the protocol that we highlighted. We do think PIH has more flexibility than always sending a troubled housing authority through this FARS protocol. I will say we've also here at HUD OIG noted that we are willing to engage in a process where we're going to put boots on the ground at some of these troubled housing authorities. We are going to send resources to address some of these troubled housing
Can
authorities.
you cite examples where HUD has been successful in pulling back an agency that's been troubled?
I do not know any off the top of my head.
But we currently have 50 that are out there right now.
And there are currently 4 PHAs in administrative receivership, obviously, 3 others on top of Alexander County. With the 50, I can say that there is 1 that has been troubled since 2003. As was indicated, many of these troubled housing authorities are supposed to only be allowed, even in the FARS protocol, a 2-year cure period. And that's not even required under PIH requirements. But
with any of these troubled housing agencies, I mean, how confident are you that there are not facilities there that would be in the same condition as Elmwood and McBride?
I'm absolutely sure there are other facilities out there like Elmwood and McBride.
And what is the department doing about that?
I do believe the recommendations that we made are a start. But once again, it's only a start. It's going to take a more collective effort on the part of all of us. And as I indicated, HUD OIG is prepared to be an independent voice, and I think a necessary independent voice in that process.
Yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Beatty, for 5 minutes.
Thank you to Chairman Duffy and to Ranking Member Cleaver and to you, Mr. Kirtland. I echo all the comments of my colleagues, and certainly the chairman is correct. There's enough blame to go around. As I kind of sat here and thought about going back beyond 2010 and 2000, we've probably had an equal number of Democrat and Republican HUD directors, because we know this doesn't happen overnight. This is very troublesome for me. I spent 20 years of my life as a relocation consultant with PHAs, and I've been in facilities that look like that. So I am sure you are correct that there are more than the surface 4 or 5 that you mentioned, because as great as my state and my district is, I can remember walking in a facility and thinking, someone's mother and grandmother lives in this facility, and no one would want to have someone here with mold and rodents, and the story ends well. We moved all of those individuals out, tore down that public housing and rebuilt it, and moved many of them back into Jenkins Terrace or 1100 in Columbus, Ohio. This is very disturbing to me as I sit here and I think about not the bricks and mortar, but the people. You know, what was the process? Can you explain to the committee the level or mode of communication with the tenants through this process? Was HUD keeping them updating or informing them what was occurring with their housing authority?
While I do think, you know, as far as looking back on the effort to address the tenants and the tenants' concerns, I do think that was a huge overlooked process in all this, and I don't know what all contributed to it. Obviously, there was engagement with the tenants. There was an opportunity to hear the tenants, but obviously something didn't register, because the concerns that were being raised, the concerns that were brought forward by the tenants. I mean, to have tenants who are having to spray bug spray on their children so they can sleep at night, that is something that should register a problem.
Let me ask you what you think about this. You know, I've been on both sides. I started early in my professional career being a housing inspector in public housing, and that's what led me later to make it part of my company when I became a consultant. Earlier this year, Congress passed legislation that would reduce the frequency of public housing inspections at small rural agencies to once to every 3 years. I oppose that legislation. So I guess my question to you is, if these buildings are inspected less frequently, would that increase the risk that HUD would fail to identify some of these deteriorating conditions until it's too late? You know, if I start having a leak in my kitchen or any of our kitchens or in our basement, and you catch it, you know, in the first year. But if we've now changed it, and that did not sit well with me because of the many years that I have spent working and involved in public housing authorities. So can you address that when we talk about that? That's something we did right here. And I just couldn't support it because I think we needed to be in there more often doing this.
I believe.
Do you believe that we should go 3 years, or should we go back to inspecting it every year?
I believe our report highlighted the importance of the inspection process. The inspection process is important to this overall process to
But
ensure
inspection, 3 years or 1 year. If you now seeing what you've seen and what you've written, we've heard Democrats and Republicans both talking about, you know, this just didn't start in 1 year, but would you think if you're seeing something in the first year, or you're waiting to the third year, and you have these conditions?
I will say our our overall body of work has identified a concern overall with the inspection process. It is not consistently applied to begin with, and that was indicated even in Alexander County, just to have a score go from, I think, 42 to 82, and then back down to an even lower number than the 2012 number. I think the inspection process is a valuable process. We haven't looked at specifically what's the right amount of time, but it's got to be a necessary process to include.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witness for appearing as well. Please allow me to ask a few questions about some of the circumstances that cause this condition to manifest itself. Is it true that between 2010 and 2016, the Budget Control Act caused cuts of about $1.6 billion in funding to housing?
I would have to check those numbers, but I know there were substantial cuts.
Does substantial mean more than $1 billion?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And is it true that as a result of this, we're losing about 10,000 public housing units per year due to disrepair? I'm not exactly sure of the number, but we are losing a good number of public housing units. Is it fair to say that we're losing a good number because of disrepair?
We have not looked at what has been the cause of that, but I think that's a big cause in it.
That's a big cause.
Yes.
I'll accept that terminology. And is it true that notwithstanding the lack of maintenance at these projects, that this level of disrepair, some of it associated with the big cuts, is something that we are seeing in many other housing projects across the country?
I'm not sure that we have looked at the connection there, but
Is that a fair inference?
that could certainly be a fair inference.
The reason I brought this up is because I agree with what was said earlier, and I would even add more to it, and I'm going to circle around and come back to where I am now. But I agree that based on what was said about the employment discrimination, civil rights violations, the management was uncooperative, mismanagement, $400,000 in misuse of funds, misadministration of contracts, properties beyond rehabilitation, $720,000 in civil penalties, $188,000 in assessments based on false claims, and nepotism. All of that's bad. So we have that now to put aside. But circling back to where I was, I mention this because my dear friend made the comment that money wasn't the problem. And money is a problem. Let's move all of these issues aside. Money is still a problem, is it not?
I would say there are many contributing factors. Obviously,
Would you say that money is one of the contributing factors?
there are resource issues, and
Can
money
we
being
define
one of the
resource as
resources.
money?
Money would be one of the resource issues, but there are many contributing problems to the problem.
There's many, but what we don't want to do is minimize the impact of over $1 billion in cuts. We don't want to minimize the impact that $1 billion can have as resources on these projects. Is that a fair statement?
Money can definitely have an impact on the resource on these projects.
All right, well, listen, I do appreciate your appearing today, and I just want us to think about not only this laundry list that I've called your attention, but also about what are we going to do to preserve housing for people who really need it in this country. And I see that you want to respond. I'll yield to you to respond, and I'll take about 15 seconds to wrap up. Go ahead, sir.
I will note as well that in the process of all of this time that ACHA has been on this downward spiral, a substantial amount of money has been spent, and wastefully spent, unfortunately, because the oversight was not there to do it.
Let's accept that, but before I lose my time, is it also true that there are other circumstances where properties are in disrepair due to a lack of funds?
Absolutely.
Okay, so we want to take care of this. And by the way, I think somebody should go to jail as well. But I also think that we have to look at these problems in a sober fashion when we are talking about the remedy. And I thank you for your testimony. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I want to thank Mr. Kirkland for his testimony. And you may get some follow-up questions. I would ask you to answer those in a prompt fashion, whether in this situation it's a money problem versus a waste of money problem, to be clear. I don't want to do a second round. We do have votes tonight. Otherwise, I would go into that. But again, I want to thank you for your testimony. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions to the chair, which we would then forward to Mr. Kirkland for hopefully his prompt as possible response. I ask a witness, again, to get back to us as soon as possible with that. Thank you for your testimony, and this hearing is adjourned.